Hello, everybody. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Blessed Yule, and all that good stuff. I am recording this on Christmas Day, December 25th, 2023. This is the Horror Trans Podcast. I believe we're all the way up to episode 4, so yay. Um, this is a companion to my Horror Trans YouTube channel where I talk about all things horror. Well, on the YouTube channel, I mostly focus on horror reviews and horror icons. So the podcast, as a companion to that, opens me up and allows me to talk about video games, comic books, TV shows, and other things that are not quite fitting of the rent or buy format of the movie reviews or the horror icons, where I just talk about somebody famous from the horror family. So today's show, I have only 3 topics planned. Um, Again, I try to keep these episodes to roughly an hour long. So I hope these topics can get me there. And without going over, as they say in the game show business. Rest in peace, Bob Barker. You were a cultural icon. All right, so our first topic is remakes, reboots, and requels. Oh my. Now, Hollywood, and especially horror, have been doing remakes since the beginning of time. They're nothing new. I mean, there's a bajillion examples of them. And there are movies that people thought were original that were actually remakes. Whenever they shit on remakes. So I'm not here to shit on remakes. I think remakes are a good thing because it introduces a young audience to a movie that they might not have been introduced to, and then that can lead them to the classic movie that it was being remade. Now, remakes come in a couple of different flavors, but the majority of them are either reimaginings of the original story. So they'll, follow the basic plot and have some of the same characters. They may change their names and personalities slightly, but they're essentially the same movie, more or less, with some, changes to fit the modern sensibilities. The lesser, or I would say more rare, but lesser common type of remake is the shot for shot remake, where it's literally just the same movie redone with a new cast and modern, technology, etc. Those aren't as common. People like to get huffy over the particulars of what is considered a remake. For example, John Carpenter's The Thing is technically a remake of The Thing from Another World, but it's also actually a retelling of the story that The Thing from Another World is based on. So you can look at it both ways. And I think it's fair either way you go. To be fair, some of the best horror movies ever made are remakes of previous horror movies. And some examples would be the 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula is the definitive Dracula, in my opinion. The Evil Dead remake from, I believe, 2013 or thereabouts is the definitive Evil Dead, in my opinion. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre by Platinum Dunes from 2003 is the definitive Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in my opinion. And those are just 3 examples. And obviously, I would put John Carpenter's Thing above The Thing from Another World, but, that one's contentious, but I still count it. So, suck it. That's not to say all remakes are good, because sometimes they miss the mark. I have not seen all the remakes that are out there. I haven't seen all the movies that are out there. But I can say this: I've actually honestly seen more good remakes that I liked than remakes that I didn't like. Now, I didn't talk about cultural remakes, and what I mean by that is where a movie is made in one culture, like for example Asia, and then remade for a Western audience, as another example. So the one that comes to mind is The Ring, which is a remake of Ringu, which is, I believe, either Japanese or Korean, but don't quote me on that because I just know that it's Asian and I don't want to be culturally insensitive. But I also am too lazy to look it up because I've never seen Ringu, and I'm a huge fan of The Ring, so I have no interest in or desire to see Ringu because I don't want to taint my perception of The Ring. Which is understandable. This is one of the reasons why some people don't like remakes, because they don't want to taint their image of the original. Which was the common complaint thrown at the 2010 Platinum Dunes A Nightmare on Elm Street remake, which I actually enjoyed tremendously and gave a positive review. But I understand where people are coming from when they don't like it, because Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 is my favorite movie of all time, and I think it's one of the most important movies in the history of horror cinema, and so I can understand why some people wouldn't want to mess with it. And then you get oddballs, like the 1998 Psycho, which is 97% a shot-for-shot remake of the original, with a little bit more explicit adult content added, whereas some of those things were only implied in the original. So, this is a case where they showed you things that the original just made you picture in your mind. Some people don't like that, especially some of the things they show you make some people uncomfortable. And then you have the rare example, and I believe there might be others like this, of Human Centipede 2, which is sort of a remake of Human Centipede, but it's also meta in that it is a copycat. It treats Human Centipede like a movie, and it's a guy in the real world recreating the events of Human Centipede himself, I guess. I've yet to see it, but that's what I've read about it, so don't quote me on any of this shit. Next on the list is reboots. Now, a reboot is a little harder to define because it is more or less a remake. But it's also intended to be a relaunch of the franchise, which is what A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010 was. It wasn't a straight remake. It was intended to be a reboot. It failed at that. It didn't fail as a movie. It got critical praise, and it did well at the box office. What sunk that movie was the fan backlash. Rightfully so, because I agree with some of their points. Even though I do tend to enjoy the movie, I'll accept the criticisms of it because they're valid. Now, a reboot, a prime example of a reboot, I have two examples that I would like to discuss. The first one is the aforementioned 2003 Platinum Dunes Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which did go on to get its own direct sequel, which was a topic for another day, technically a prequel. But we're not talking about prequels today because, holy God, we'll be here forever if I get into prequels. And I'd have to spend 3 hours defending the Star Wars prequels, and I don't have the time to do that right now. The other big one is Halloween. Now, Halloween is interesting because it's actually been rebooted at least 3 times. The first reboot was a soft reboot called Halloween H2O, which sort of continued the story that was established in the Halloween movies, but also ignored elements of the franchise and just sort of went back to a different point in time and continued from there. The second Halloween reboot was Rob Zombie's reboot, which again was intended to be a franchise, and it did get a sequel. H2O also got a sequel, a direct sequel. And then the third reboot was Halloween 2018, which got 2 direct sequels, Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends. Now, Halloween 2018, is it's not just an example of a reboot, it's also an example of a requel, which is an interesting and unique modern phenomena, relatively modern. A requel is a remake slash reboot intended to breathe new life into a franchise that also serves as a direct or indirect sequel to previously established canon. And this would be Halloween 2018. It ignores everything after the first Halloween movie, taking pot shots at some of it, and then it just continues from there like a true proper sequel. This was also done in Scream with Scream 4, and then Scream 5 and 6 were continuations of what they did in Scream 4. And Scream 4 actually tackles requels. That was the subject matter of the meta commentary of that movie, as well as internet fame, you know. So, that's another topic for another day. But, you know, yeah. Based on the few examples of requels I have seen, I'm going to put this out there. I am not a fan of the phenomenon. I prefer either a straight reboot, start over from scratch, and go forward from there like they did with Batman Begins, like just a full, fresh reboot, or a proper sequel that picks up where we left off and acknowledges and respects everything that came before. This is one of the reasons why I despise the Halloween franchise so much, because the Halloween movies I actually enjoy are the ones that often get ignored. Namely Halloween 2, Halloween 4, and Halloween 6. My three of the favorites of the franchise are the ones that usually get ignored. And it kind of pisses me off that they ignore the only ones I like. It really frustrates me. Because it's very disrespectful to the franchise. Especially whereas 4 is the best one out of all of them. Don't at me. It's the truth. And if you don't see the truth yet, you will. Watch it again. You'll see the truth. It's the only true, legit slasher in this fucking slasher franchise. Save for Halloween Kills, which I'll say Halloween Kills is a slasher. The rest of them are like suspense, thriller, murder mysteries. But Halloween 4 is a legit slasher. And I'm a slasher fan, which that's a topic I'm going to talk about for another day. It's on the list. Don't worry. Don't fret. It's coming. So, in my opinion, remakes can be good. Reboots are iffy, and requels have not yet proven me that they can be good yet. I just haven't seen a good requel yet. Sidebar, with the exception, I would say, being Netflix Chainsaw Massacre from 2022. That's a damn good movie. I loved that one. The one where they go to Texas, you know, the hippie dippies who go to Texas to, not hippie dippies, hipsters, whatever the fuck they're called, to try to breathe new life into the town. And yeah, that's a damn good movie. And I think the movie does not deserve the hate it gets. But I don't know if that was intended to be a requel or a reboot. I'm not 100% sure, because it does the requel thing where it does continue previous canon while also ignoring previous canon, and it may have been setting up sequels that have either yet to be announced or produced, if they're even coming, which is questionable considering the backlash that movie undeservedly got. And I say undeservedly because it's a damn fucking good movie. Whereas the 2003 Platinum Dunes, to me, is the definitive Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Netflix Chainsaw Massacre, to me, is the best in the franchise. It's the best of all of them. But it's not, you know, it's not really connected to the Platinum Dunes movie in any shape or form. So it's fuzzy and messy and complicated. But that's the way I like my horror. I don't want things to be simple, because simple is boring, and who wants life to be boring? I don't really have anything else I can say about this, other than, some remakes are good, some are bad, and requels are fishy, and reboots are hit or miss. Moving on, next topic of the day is a continuation of the first topic that started this podcast. This is 16-bit horror games. So in the 16-bit era, we're finally getting to where the technology is almost advanced enough you can do a horror game right. Now, the 8-bit era had plenty of horror games I've already talked about. But most of that is, setting and theme, but you're not getting a lot of good horror imagery. You're not getting a lot of gore. You're not getting a lot of scares. This starts to change in the 16-bit era. So first up, we have three entries in the Castlevania franchise. We have Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo, Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, and Castlevania Dracula X also for the Super Nintendo. We don't talk about the TurboGrafx 16 because that was an 8-bit system, so, don't at me. Already talked about it in the 8-bit section, so go back to that. So let's take these one at a time. Like their 8-bit counterparts, the Castlevania games are side-scrolling action platformers. Kind of, sort of hack-and-slash games, but not fully hack-and-slash games. Super Castlevania 4 is kind of a direct... Speaking of requels and reboots, it is kind of a reboot of the requel of the original, because it's both a continuation of the Castlevania story, but also a retelling of the first one. It uses a lot of the same levels and monsters and such from the first game. Castlevania Bloodlines is kind of an oddity because I interpret Castlevania Bloodlines as sort of an alternate universe of Castlevania. I don't know where it fits in the canon timeline, if at all. It also serves as a standalone Castlevania for the Sega Genesis crowd, as well as a soft reboot of the original Castlevania, while also being its own game. And then you have Castlevania Dracula X, which is fuzzy and complicated, and I don't want to talk about it too much. Super Castlevania 4 is an A+ game, 5 out of 5 on if you want me to rank it. It's a damn good game. It's a perfect game. Flawless in every way, shape, and form. One of the best of the Castlevania franchise. And it's a legit horror game. It does have some mild instances of gore and blood. But it is legit scary. It is actually a scary game. Castlevania Bloodlines is a little different in that it is tailor-made for the Sega Genesis audience. So it has more action elements than the other Castlevanias, because Genesis games tend to have more action in them versus platforming and exploration that is popular in the Nintendo side of things. Bloodlines is still a damn good game. This was, growing up, my Castlevania game. This is the one from my childhood. This was the Castlevania I played. It was the only Castlevania I owned in my actual childhood. And I had it for the Sega Genesis. All my other Castlevanias I got as an adult collector or as a retro gamer on like Virtual Console or other methods I won't talk about here yet. So, Bloodlines is a pretty good game. I would give it a solid 4.5 out of 5. It's not as good as Castlevania 4, but it's still pretty damn good. Dracula X is a fucking mess of a game. It isn't worth your time. Don't fucking play it. There are better Castlevanias out there. Next up, we have the Splatterhouse franchise. Splatterhouse originated in the arcades. Its first home console port was the 8-bit TurboGrafx 16. I know, confusing, but it is what it is. And the sequels, Splatterhouse 2 and Splatterhouse 3, were exclusive, to my knowledge, to the Sega Genesis. And these are damn good horror games. I mean, you're not just talking horror imagery and atmosphere. You're talking scares. You're talking thrills. You're talking gore and blood and violence. I mean, this has it all. These games are not for kids. Excuse me, I keep saying Castlevania. The Splatterhouse games, the Castlevania games are accessible to children. The Splatterhouse games are not. These are the Saw of horror video games in the 16-bit era. Not appropriate for children. Splatterhouse 2 and 3 also have a lot of horror music that is very atmospheric, which I didn't talk about the music on Castlevania because I already did in the 8-bit episode. It's good. It's the best part of the franchise. The music is what makes those games. Next, we have a lesser-known game that was also exclusive, to my knowledge, of on the Sega Genesis. There may have been possibly an Amiga port. I can't confirm or deny this. It's called Haunting, starring Poltergeist. Now, this is unique because this is one of the first I would classify as a survival horror game, sort of. You're in a haunted mansion, and in this game, you are the ghost. You're the poltergeist. And what you're doing is activating things in the house. You're having blood come out of the walls. You're turning on ceiling fans. You're throwing books off the bookshelves, etc. Trying to scare the inhabitants of the house out the door. But you're also in danger yourself of being sent back to hell, where you can be tortured. And if you die in hell, you die. Game over. So that makes this game legit scary because, you don't just die and you're left to the unknown. You're literally sent to hell. So, oops, that's where we are. The next game I want to talk about, some people would argue isn't horror, but I don't think those people know what horror is. It's Mortal Kombat and the Mortal Kombat franchise. There were 4 technically Mortal Kombat games in the 16-bit era. All arcade games that got home console ports on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, and a handful of ports elsewhere, but we're only talking about the Genesis, Super NES ports. So the first one is Mortal Kombat 1. The horror elements here are kind of subtle. It's more of a martial arts supernatural game than anything, but you do have a four-headed dragon in a dungeon with skeletons and skulls littered about. And when you are on the pit stage, if you fall off, you land on a bed of spikes, and you are presented a whole host of unfortunate fighters who lost their rounds and landed on the bed of spikes as well. So you get a lot of dismembered and decapitated bodies with blood and gore everywhere. And Mortal Kombat also has a... we'll talk about the fatalities in just a brief second. The main villain of Mortal Kombat is a sorcerer who, when he beats you, he doesn't kill you. He literally steals your soul and uses that to power himself. That is terrifying. Mortal Kombat also has a giant lizard man dressed up like a human fighter. It has a skeleton demon from hell dressed up like a human fighter. It has a thunder god pretending to be a human fighter. It has an assassin, and it has a crime boss dude. It's straight up horror. It is. Now, Mortal Kombat 2 and 3, and by extension, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which is the 4th in the franchise, are really horror. Now we're getting into more gore, scarier backgrounds, scarier music, more violent and gruesome fatalities. Although the first one had some pretty gruesome fatalities, don't get me wrong. The Sub-Zero fatality is top-notch in that department. Again, you have the four-armed... you have another four-armed, half-human, half-dragon in Kintaro, and another one with Shiva. And again, you have an evil sorcerer stealing souls. You've got the fate of the world in your hands, literally, and everything else from the first Mortal Kombat game just dialed up to 10. And that was already a 10. So just 10 more, I guess. However, gameplay, I will admit, Mortal Kombat doesn't really evoke the horror theme as much as in the gameplay department. It's mostly in the story and the backstory and stuff. Because it's basically just a martial arts fighting game. You know, you just go in the arena, you beat each other up, and then when you're done, you decapitate your opponent, more or less. The next horror game is more of a kid-friendly horror game. Again, this one is on the Sega Genesis. It is an action platformer by the name of Decap Attack. Now, what makes this a horror game is you're a headless dude who walks around throwing your head at people, hence the name Decap Attack. And you're fighting generic horror enemies. And it's got horror imagery and backgrounds and music, etc. The next one is on the Super Nintendo. It is a sort of tie-in / continuation, or spin-off, if you will, of the Ghosts and Goblins franchise. And the game is called Demon Attack. No, excuse me, Demon's Crest. Why did I say Demon Attack? It's called Demon's Crest. Like the Ghosts and Goblins games, this one is horror, again, in the imagery and the music and the theme and the setting. But also, this time around, you're playing as a literal demon. You can't get more horror than that. I'm sorry, you just can't. Similarly, there are two 16-bit entries in the proper Ghosts and Goblins franchise. You have Super Ghosts and Goblins on the Super Nintendo and Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Genesis. Which is, they're both kind of, sort of sequels to the original, but also kind of sort of remakes of the original. So again, reboots, requels, etc. And they're both A+ games. I highly recommend them if you haven't played them. Next up, we have a lesser-known game, which is based on a lesser-known horror movie. And it is a creepy, I want to say action-adventure game, but it's not really straight action. It's kind of a platformer, but more of a puzzler exploration game. And it's called Nosferatu. This one is undeniably horror, because it's literally based on a horror movie, excuse me. The last two I'm going to talk about briefly, partially because I don't want to spend a lot of time on this segment, and also because one of them I've never played. I just saw it on a list, and I put it on my list so I could mention it, and then you'll have to research it yourself. But it's called Clock Tower, and I'm going to be honest, I know nothing about this game, but I'm intrigued enough that I want to check it out. And the last one is Dracula, more specifically Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is based on the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, there are a couple of different versions of this game, depending on which home console you're playing it on. But it is more or less captures the feel of the horror movie Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula. So it definitely counts as a horror video game in my book. And I had the Sega CD version of this game, and we're not talking about CD-ROM games yet, so we'll get there. Now, there are other horror games in the 16-bit era, but these are the ones that I think are the least controversial, the easiest to talk about, and probably, for the most part, the most accessible. I saw some games on other people's horror games lists that had me scratching my head. What the fuck is that doing on a list of horror games list? So I didn't put them on my list because I wasn't going to try to stretch them like these assholes did. And I'm not going to give you the examples because you'll have to figure it out yourself. And likewise, I'm not talking about Doom here, even though there is a Super Nintendo port, because one, that version is rubbish and not worth talking about, and two, Doom is going to be talked about more in depth when I get to either CD-ROM games or PC games, whichever one is more appropriate. So, tentatively, the final topic for this podcast, depending on how much time I get out of it, is Final Girls. So let's talk Final Girls. Final Girl is a trope, and there can be also a Final Boy or, gender fluid, non-binary, whatever. It doesn't have to be a girl. But we call them Final Girls because they typically tend to be female, mostly human. There may or may not be exceptions that we'll discover together. So the Final Girl trope is more common in the slasher franchise, but it does exist in other horror genres. And I keep mixing up franchise with genre. Excuse me. The slasher genre, which is a subgenre of horror, is known for its Final Girls. So the formula is you have a serial killer, sometimes unknown, sometimes known, stalking a group of teenagers who are usually doing, we'll say, inappropriate things for their age. And they're being stalked by a murderer who picks them off one by one, typically in a very violent and brutal fashion, more often than not. And you always have one survivor who is more often than not, but not 100% always, a virgin who did not partake in the vices that the other victims did, who also tends to somehow be the only one with a brain cell in their head, who knows to run out the door and start the car and not go up the stairs and lock the closet door like an idiot. Hence the reason why she's the final girl, because she's the only one who survives, because she's the only one with half a brain. Now, sometimes your final girl is a fighter, like Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street. And sometimes she's a victim who just happens to survive just based on pure luck alone, which is how I would describe every single final girl in the Friday the 13th franchise, because none of them had any fucking brain cells either. They just sort of got lucky and Jason gave up. The most famous final girl, who I don't like to talk about, is Laurie Strode from the Halloween franchise. And I don't like to talk about Laurie Strode because the timeline is fucking goddamn convoluted. And there's at least 4, possibly 5, or even 6 different versions of the same fucking character. So you can't really attribute any specific set of qualities to the character as a whole, because they don't all exhibit these qualities. But in general terms, Laurie Strode tends to be more like the Friday the 13th final girl, and she just happens to get lucky and survive the movie more often than not. Whereas there's one example I can think of where she actually legitimately outsmarts Michael Myers, and that's Halloween 2018. That's the only one where she actually outsmarts Michael Myers. The rest of them, she just fucking manages to survive. And in one of them, she allegedly kills him. Oops, she killed the wrong guy. That happens more than once in the Halloween franchise, unfortunately. It's a stupid red herring that pisses me off every time they do it. But they've done it more than once, so, whatever. And then you have the rare instance where who you thought was going to be the final girl actually turned out to be the killer. The most famous example of this, there are other examples I could look up. I've seen them, so I know they exist. But the most famous example of the final girl actually turning out to be the killer is Sleepaway Camp. And Sleepaway Camp kind of had you wondering who the killer was, and they left some red herring clues that made you think it was someone else, but upon rewatching it, they were pretty obvious. So it was like, oh yeah, I guess they, once you know who the killer is, it's very in your face, not subtle at all. But your first time watching it, if you don't know anything about it, you might be suspicious of the other person they want you to be suspicious of. However, the thing with Sleepaway Camp is the final girl slash killer, and I'm spoiling the movie here, is actually kind of sort of a trans person in that it's a boy pretending to be a girl. And I say kind of sort of a trans person. This movie is problematic in that regard because the character. So here's I'm going to go ahead and spoil it. The movie is about a young boy and his sister and his dad who are swimming on the lake, and the dad and the sister die in a boating accident, and they go to live with their I'm going to say aunt slash uncle because it's ambiguous. Gender non-conforming relative, I'll say, who is depicted as possibly homosexual. Well, okay, I say possibly. It's a guy dressed up like a girl having sex with a guy dressed up like a girl, but they don't specify if either of them are trans or not. So, like I said, it's ambiguous. And this was made in the 80s before we had the language we have today to better define these terms. So, like I said, it's ambiguous, but also somewhat problematic. The gender non-conforming parent already has a son and doesn't want two sons because, I'll say they in this instance, doesn't think that would be proper. So they force, against his will, the boy to go by the name Angela and dress like a girl. And I say against his will because you can tell by and I'll use her in this instance, Angela's facial expressions, she doesn't want to be a girl. She does not like being a girl. She doesn't embrace it. She doesn't enjoy it. It's just something she has no choice in the matter, so she goes along with it. Now, mostly, I've been using the term final girl here, but on rarer occasions, you actually have a final boy. And in the most famous two examples of this, you have A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, an ill-named movie that shouldn't be called Freddy's Revenge because he's literally not getting revenge on fucking anyone at all. So, that's a mark against the goddamn movie. But you have again, not necessarily gender-confused character, but sexually ambiguous character in that he's decidedly a cisgender male, but he's very gay-coded and possibly homosexual, and definitely played unambiguously by a homosexual actor who was gay-coding the character, directed by a gay director who definitely gay-coded the movie. So, it is technically, if you're using queer terminology, accurate to refer to Jessie as a final girl, because gay men do refer to themselves as female, at least loosely, and not in the sense that a trans woman does, but in the sense that they're like, hey girl. So it is accurate to consider Jessie a final girl. Or we could use the more accurate, or less, I shouldn't say accurate, but the alternative categorization of final girl, which is a scream queen. Now, scream queen doesn't necessarily apply to just slashers. Scream queens can exist outside the slasher franchise. So again, final girl is a trope of slasher, whereas scream queen is a trope of broader horror in general. The next male final girl, I know it's confusing, but it is what it is. Follow along. It's not that complicated if you follow along. The next male final girl, I just did a horror icons video on, and this is Ashley from the Evil Dead franchise. And yes, his name is Ashley, which again is a gender, I don't know. I'd say gender neutral name. I've never heard of a male Ashley, so it is what it is. Ashley is a girl's name as far as I'm concerned. But according to this movie, it can be a boy's name too, I guess. Ashley is unique because he's the only final boy that I'm aware of who survives one horror movie to not only survive multiple horror movies, but actually fully evolves and transforms as a character from a hapless victim to a legit badass who is more than capable of taking on the villain himself. Very competent soldier in this sense. And yes, one of his movies is called Army of Darkness, so I'm going to call him a soldier. Now, the second most famous final girl, who is, in my opinion, the definition of final girl. She's the final girl to end all final girls. She's the best one. She's the one worth really talking about. And this is obviously Sidney Prescott from the Scream franchise, as portrayed by the beautiful Neve Campbell, who is an amazing person, and we should all respect her more than we do. Like Ashley in Evil Dead, Sidney, or Sid as she's sometimes called, does go from hapless victim, and yes, happenstance, lucky survivor at the end of the first movie, to eventually evolving into a warrior in her own right, who is more than capable of not only thwarting the bad guy, but also kicking the living shit out of him or her. Because it's, it can be a man, it can be a woman, it's never consistent. That's the beauty of Scream. So, Sidney has not been in all of the Scream movies, unfortunately, but she's been in 5 of the 6, or 4 of the 6, I should say. I don't know if she was in, I can't remember if she was in 5 or not, now that I think about it. I mean, I know she's not in 6, but I can't remember if she was in 5 or not, so I apologize for that, but she's at least in the first 4. So she's in all of the ones that had Wes Craven's fingerprints on them, I'll say that. Which is good for her, because Wes Craven is a genius in the horror franchise, and he deserves way more credit than he often gets. So long as we don't talk about People Under the Stairs, we can pretend like that movie never happened and talk about him elsewhere. Sidney also is very skeptical of everyone. She's automatically suspicious anyone can be the killer. And so she has no trust in anyone, not even Gale Weathers, her closest friend, save for Dewey, who might also be her other closest friend. So it's hard to say which one she's closer to. I guess maybe I would say she's closer to Dewey, but anyways, we're not here to analyze Scream. Sidney is also interesting because she is generally the focus of the movies, in that it's her life story. The killers almost always, and I say almost always because there are exceptions, have a personal grudge against Sidney for one reason or another. And it usually comes back to something from her past. More often than not involving her mother, or in some cases just her herself, like in the case of Scream 4, it was Scream 5. She was in Scream 5, I just remembered. Where it's actually her cousin, I believe, who goes off the deep end because she's jealous of Sidney. God, why can't I remember Scream 5? Holy shit. Sidney was like the whole focus of the movie, and I forgot that somehow. Wow, I need to rewatch Scream 5, I guess. And, most other examples of final girls in slasher movies, yes, even the ones portrayed by Jamie Lee Curtis, who is a legit bona fide scream queen who has been in multiple slasher franchises, most of the rest of them just tend to be forgettable. Nobody's talking about whatever her name was in Prom Night, or whatever her name was in Friday the 13th, or Pieces, or Body Count, or whatever, you know. Now you get some examples where the final girl survives one movie and then ends up dying in one of the sequels. Usually the direct sequel, but not always. Nancy Thompson dies in part 3, but she's only passively mentioned in part 2. And we don't talk about Wes Craven's New Nightmare because that is not a bona fide slasher. I don't know what the fuck it is, but I don't like talking about it. Because that movie just boils my blood and pisses me off to no end. I hate that movie. It's fucking rubbish. Oh my god, I hate that movie. There is at least one instance I can think of where the final girl, again, is technically a boy, but in this instance, it's actually a child, and this is Andy from Child's Play. Now, you could argue, if you wanted, that the mother is kind of, sort of, also a final girl in Child's Play, but it's Andy's story. The mother is just a side character who just happens to be there to move the plot along. It's Andy's story, that movie. And so Andy, in my estimation, is the final girl in this instance, or final boy if you want to be technical, I guess, of Child's Play. Now, Child's Play and the subsequent Chucky franchise does eventually abandon Andy in favor of Chucky just giving up and saying, who gives a shit, he's worthless to me. And he just moves on with his life. So Andy is only in the first 3 Chucky movies that I know of. I have not seen all of them. And that's not for want of a desire. It's just a matter of, come on. There's literally thousands of horror movies out there for me to watch. I can't get to them all. And I just tortured myself trying to watch the entire Hellraiser franchise. And yes, I mean tortured myself. Because good fucking God, those movies, some of them are awful. But anyways, so in the slasher franchise, final girl and sometimes final boy tends to be one of the defining traits that is one of the most well-defined traits, because it happens more often than it doesn't happen. There are examples of what I would call slasher movies that don't have a final girl at all. Again, the one example would be Sleepaway Camp, where the final girl turns out to be the killer. And then I'm not going to talk about this movie at all because I'm doing a review of it, but it's called Final Girls. This is a slasher movie that is like Scream in that it's also a meta commentary on slasher movies. But it's a lot of fun, so I'll talk about it when the time comes. But for right now, I just want to say it does exist. It's out there. And so, yeah, slasher movies are pretty fucking awesome in my opinion. I love them. Now, I have 2 movies I want to throw out there that I want to ask you, the audience, listening to this, leave a comment. Do you consider either of these 2 movies slashers? Because to me, it's ambiguous. I could go either way. I could be convinced one way or the other. The first one is Alien from 1979, made by Ridley Scott, starring the Scream Queen herself. God damn it, my mind just went blank. She plays Dana Barrett in Ghostbusters. Well, I forgot her name, so fuck me. Shit. I can't remember her name. Okay, so I had to pause the video so I could Google, and it's Sigourney Weaver, and I feel stupid for forgetting her name because I know who Sigourney Weaver is. It's early in the morning, I guess. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so whatever. So let me know, do you consider Alien a slasher movie? The second one, I haven't heard come up in conversations a lot, but I'm curious as well. It's The Faculty from 1998, I believe. I have not seen it on lists of slasher movies, so I wonder if other people do or don't consider it a slasher movie. Because if you do, I would say it kind of breaks some of the rules in that you don't have a single character that survives at the end. And again, the main character who survives, the one who like saves the day, is a man or a boy, a teenage boy, we'll say. Played by a middle-aged man. I'm just kidding. Hollywood does that a lot. No, he was pretty young in that movie. He might have been in his 20s, perhaps. I don't know. But anyways, let me know. Do you consider The Faculty or Alien, either or, a slasher movie? And if so, why or why not? That's all I have for today, so stay cool.